In our last discussion, we were talking about subtractive system, hue contrast, and properties of subtractive color, which are value, hue, and intensity. We were talking about spectral sequence that is the natural order of the 12 hues around the hue circle. And we were also talking about why the 12 hue circle makes sense. The after image effect is constantly present in our vision, and when you see the complement of the color that you're looking at, it causes a balance. So the 12 hue system is validated because of our perceptual visual system. Intensity contrast is the difference between brightness and dullness of a hue. It's one of the 7 color contrasts that we will be discussing, the first of them being hue, and then there is value, there is intensity, of course, there is complementary and simultaneous contrast, there is temperature and extension contrast, and we'll be dealing with each one of these in turn. Intensity is not light or dark, it is bright and dull. It is the result of the saturation or the purity of a hue. When we look at a hue circle, all the hues represented are considered full intensity. They are 100% saturated. Although the terms saturation and intensity are often interchangeable, saturation is actually the physical mixture of the color, and intensity is the visual result. So it's more of a relationship. Intensity is the result of saturation. We modify intensity in various ways. When we do that, we create a plethora of colors. For instance, we can take orange at full saturation, normal value, and add white to it. We will be tinting it. We will be desaturating it. In other words, it is no longer considered pure. We are changing the lightness, darkness of it, and we're lightening it because we are adding the white. When we go from an orange to a peachy color, we still recognize the orange hue. So when we have certain hue effectors such as white, black, and gray, we still have the ability to identify the hue. But every time you add white to the hue, you are going to desaturate it. The more white you have, the more desaturated it will become, and therefore the less intense in perception. Another way to modify intensity is to shade, which is adding black. When we add black, we increase the darkness, so the value is increased, and the more black we add, the more desaturated and the less intense it is perceived. And again, like with the white, we still recognize the hue family. So we can go from the pure orange, which is the spectral level color, into something that's more on a terracotta, more on a rust color, and still maintain the fact that it's orange as opposed to yellow-orange or as opposed to red. Another way to modify intensity is to add both black and white at the same time. So you're adding the equivalent of a gray. By toning, adding the gray, you may or may not change the value, the perceived lightness or darkness, depending upon the value of the gray. Tones are recognized because they look dirty, and because you're adding both black and white, you are desaturating to a greater degree than if you're adding only black or white. So there is a much stronger dullness going on. Until you get really grayed out, you can still perceive the hue family. The fourth way to modify intensity is to neutralize. And neutralizing will actually get you to what we call an achromatic, a color that has no chroma, also known as a true neutral. And in popular color naming, we recognize these as gray, or we call them grays. So something like this may appear to be grayed, but it is not a gray because it has chroma. The gray will have no chroma. So gray is an achromatic and considered true neutral, entirely desaturated or unsaturated. It has no intensity whatsoever. Grays are true neutrals. And to neutralize, you will add the complement. On a hue circle, the color that sits directly across from a hue is its complement. If we have yellow, its complement is violet, which is the mixture of the other two primaries in equal visual proportion. So violet is made up of red and blue, and then its complement is yellow, which is the third primary. In every complementary pair, you have that balance between the primaries. And this is just to show you the perceptual differences in the various de-intensified colors and the true neutral as opposed to the pure hue. So we have a fully saturated orange. We have a tint, which is desaturated and lightened. We have a shade, which is desaturated and darkened. The tone is desaturated, but it's about the same value as the orange because the gray that went into making this is the same value. A near neutral, this is where blue has been added, and you can see that there's a difference between the near neutral and the tone. The near neutral will not look dusty or dirty. It will not look as resonant as the shade, and the near neutral will not look as chalky as the tint. And then of course a true neutral, so you can see very definitely the perceptual difference of something that is achromatic, a pure or a totally unpure color, no saturation, as opposed to any of the near neutrals where a complement or a near complement has been added, or a tone, tint, or shade. And this is just another way to look at the idea of neutralization. Neutralization is adding another hue that exists across the hue circle. It is not tinting, shading, or toning. Here's our primaries, yellow, cyan, magenta, and their complements, the violet, the orange, and the green. And by mixing some of the green into the magenta, you start neutralizing. By mixing some of the magenta into the green, you start neutralizing. So this is a blue where the orange has been added, and this is an orange where the blue's been added. And of course this is yellow where the violet has been added, and violet where yellow has been added. And then the wide strip on either side is an achromatic gray made up of an equal mixture of the blue and the orange, or the yellow and the violet, or the red and the green, and then we have true black. When you mix pigments into a true neutral, you cannot get real black because the pigments do not reflect light and absorb light perfectly. When we are dealing with black in pigment in the subtractive system, we need to actually start with a black pigment. This taking from red across to green, just showing you the various steps of neutralization. So we have the true neutral, which is the really dark gray but not black. We have steps of neutrality. These are considered near neutrals. They are not true neutrals. Only an achromatic is a true neutral. And you can do this with any complementary pair. It's important to note that the colors that we call brown or earth tones are the near neutrals. So we can have earth tones that are kind of mossy, they can look brown, they can look like sage green. There's a lot of color in nature that is chromatic, and also there's a lot of true neutrals. Intensity contrast is the perceptual difference between the brightness and the dullness of color. If you put a bright color against a dull background, it will look brighter. If you put a dull color against a brighter background, that dull color will appear more dull. So in this case, we have the orange hue, the spectral level color, against the true neutral, and it's looking pretty intense. One of the ways that you recognize intensity is if you get this vibration, this kind of fluttering along the edge. It's hard to look at, and the color doesn't seem to sit still, it seems to bounce a little bit. When we look at it in reverse, the neutral against the orange, notice again that the gray, it's actually not the gray, it's the orange that's starting to flutter a little bit. Because remember, gray has no after image, but notice the effect of the orange onto the gray. This gray has a blueness to it that the gray does not appear to have in the ground above it. So compare this with this in your perception. They're exactly the same color, but this has a blueness to it because of the after image action of the orange. So we take that after image action, and now we have a complementary situation we have a spectral level blue against a fully saturated orange, and look at the amount of bounce or vibration that the orange is now undergoing. So placing a hue against its complement will increase the intensity of both, and you'll get this bounce. Same thing is happening here in reverse. We put that same orange against a near neutral, which is a combination of the blue and the orange, and the bounce is mitigated, and we don't have a sense of intensification. Things look kind of dull. One of the things that intensity contrast does is that it helps create spatial depth. When you are creating volumetric illusion, otherwise known as plastic space, one of the ways that you do that is through the concept of atmospheric perspective. And I'm sure you've experienced this if you've driven highways or freeways. Things that are closer to you are brighter, more detailed, and higher contrast than things that are further away because of the particles in the atmosphere. They will tend to dull things that are in the distance. And so you can create a great sense of spatial depth when you have atmospheric perspective, and it has a lot to do with intensity and neutrality. An atmospheric perspective is different than linear perspective, which is the law of diminishment. But when you have the two working together, it creates a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, and you can have deep space or shallow space depending upon how you manipulate that. In this photograph of Yosemite, you notice, of course, the gray granite walls and the trees in the field in front. And even though there's nothing here that's really bright or fully saturated on a spectral level, you can still see the effects of atmospheric perspective going on. You have more detail in the front and more saturation. In the middle ground, you still have saturation, and you're still getting detail. Then we have a further ground area. It looks kind of foggy or smoky right back there. And then we have the gray of the granite. Okay, again in this shot from the Great Smoky Mountains, we have very obvious atmospheric perspective. This is all in greens and kinds of blues, so because there's less hue contrast going on, we can see the atmospheric perspective more obviously. You can easily see the detail, the texture of the shrubbery in the foreground. You can see the brightness of the greens. And then in the middle ground, things start to kind of go bluish, and there is less detail in the texture. And then we go further back, and we have less detail but still have chroma. And then way in the back, we have much more neutralized, and it actually blends into the sky. This is a combination. It's a drawing of both linear perspective and the utilization of atmospheric perspective to help create that sense of depth. I alluded to the fact that atmospheric perspective combined with linear perspective will give you a great sense of volume, a great sense of depth. So we have linear perspective in terms of diminishment. The things that are closer are larger, things that are further away that are smaller. And then notice also the more vivid color in the foreground versus the softness of colors that blends into the background sky, and the great sense of pictorial depth. So compare that to something that focuses more on the linear perspective but has no atmospheric perspective whatsoever. And we have a much flatter sense of space here than we do here. They're both the same type of drawing, they're both pen and ink drawings, but here we are focusing entirely on linear perspective, whereas here we have linear perspective combined with the atmospheric for a much greater sense of depth. This should be fairly obvious. We have the figures in the foreground, both brighter and having a greater range of value contrast. And as we look behind them into the midground to the bridge, things are less contrasty in terms of value, and also they're not as bright. And then we have the skyline and the sky in the background, and no detail whatsoever in the buildings, and then just the sky in the background. This is a cloned image in terms of we have one motif that's repeated several times, but it has been reduced in scale. And notice that also they've been grayed out as they've been reduced. So this is using linear perspective and atmospheric perspective to create a great sense of depth. Now notice what the brightness does here. The brightness is all kind of midground. It's in the upper half of the image. The lower half, which is the foreground, is neutralized, grays and chromatic neutrals, very nondescript, no detail. And what's happening here is that all the action, all the color is happening in the top half of the image, so we have a visual distance between you, the viewer, and the action going on. As we're dealing with this particular story and what's happening, we have a safe zone that is separating us from this action. Color is being used to help tell the story, but also separating the viewer at a safe distance, so it's like the viewer's not being regarded by the characters in the story. Notice how the greater value contrast, the lightness and darkness, and also the brighter colors are at the further distance. And notice how flat the overall space looks. Howard Pyle still kept things up close and personal, but we have a sense of things being flatter in terms of spatial depth because of how the color is placed within the illustration. Catalog cover, notice how the more intense colors are used to create grounds for the type, bringing them forward of the achromatic imagery behind. The chromatic colors, the red, yellow, blue, the primaries, are coming even more forward than the black box above them. So here we have Spidey, and notice how the letter forms themselves, the title is actually coming forward, the figure's coming forward, and then the more neutral cityscape behind is not. We've got atmospheric perspective happening in terms of the figures, and the type and the taxi are coming forward, and everything else is grayed out. As we look at this website for a corporate realtor, we'll notice that there's an almost gray ground, but it still has some chroma to it. It has a warmth to it which is inviting, but yet very elegant, very businesslike. And then the red and the blue are not fully intense, but they are dark enough and have enough chroma to them that they do separate from the gray ground. And notice the photos also have a lot of chroma, and they separate. And so the focus here becomes the actual property renderings themselves. There is hierarchy, there's intensity, neutrality, contrast going on to create a very quiet, business-like elegance.